Hi, and welcome to this video tutorial on distributive bargaining. This is part one, and in this section we're going to take a look at what a distributive bargaining circumstance looks like so we're clear. We're going to explore how to be properly prepared for it with some simple steps. We're going to take a close look at something called the bargaining zone and how that impacts you in a distributive bargaining situation or any negotiation situation. We're going to discuss anchoring, and then finally we're going to talk about a BATNA, a best alternative to a negotiated agreement, and how to cultivate a great BATNA for a negotiation. So let's begin. The distributive bargaining situation is one that we encounter all the time. These are typically simpler negotiations. Sometimes they look at them as compromises, and basically we see them as fixed pie. In other words, we look at it and say there are limited resources and these are fixed, and it's just a matter of slicing and dicing them up in a way that ends up working reasonably well, we hope, for the parties involved. We do also see that the goals of each of the parties are typically in direct conflict with one another. In other words, if I want something over here, that means the other party has to give me something, and vice versa. It's kind of like this constant seeking of an equilibrium. But our goal is to maximize our share of that pie, of the resources that are available. That is the fundamental focus of a distributive bargaining situation, and understanding that for everything we get, it's going to have to come from the other party, and they're probably thinking the same way. So how do we enter into a distributive bargaining situation? There's so many of them, and very often we may not even realize we're doing this. But we have three things we need to do, basically. We need to set a target point. In other words, we need to have some sense of what we want that agreement to look like. It could be as simple as buying something from someone or selling something on Craigslist. It could be trying to negotiate a better deal in a store, in a retail store. Whatever it is, there's some kind of target point, whether they're talking about dollars or decision making on where we're going to a movie, a restaurant we're picking, a trip we're taking, a contract for employment, you name it. There's some kind of target point, and it's really helpful to try to get clear in advance so that you know what you're looking for. The next thing we need to be clear about is our resistance point. This is the price or outcome that if we don't hit it, we'll probably walk away from the deal, or it's not worth it for us to go with the agreement, and hopefully our BATNA, our alternative to a negotiated agreement, is better. The resistance point is something that too often I think we are not clear enough ahead of time. We sometimes hear something that will trigger, oh, that's too far. But if we're clear in advance, based on our preparation, where we're willing to go to and what our maximum is, or minimum, depending on what the resistance point is, that will help us in terms of how we figure out ways to get to our target point with our opponent. And then the last thing we need to include, and of course this is often the first thing we think of, is our asking price if we're selling, or the initial offer if we're buying. So let's take a simple transaction on Craigslist. Typically, not always, but typically ads have some kind of an asking price for whatever is being sold. In most cases, there is some room for negotiation. Sometimes people will say the price is firm and that's the end of it, and likely these folks are pretty clear that this is their firm price. We make an initial offer where we feel there is room to negotiate if it's something that we want, and there can be a tendency to really want to lowball this because we want to bring the price down as much as possible. We have to be thinking kind of strategically here, because if our offer is very low, people may just ask us to go away. If we think about our offer as a tool to help us get to our target point, then maybe we will think about it a little bit more clearly and see how we can create space to get to that target point. There's a term that's used called an anchor or an anchor point. So think of it this way. At the very beginning of a negotiation, there is an initial presentation of either a selling price or an initial position. Let's take something simple, like something being advertised on Craigslist. And let's say the person has a price posted of $500. That initial selling price creates an anchor in the mind of a potential buyer. In other words, it creates kind of what we might think of as an upper limit or a place to reach for. An initial offer from a potential buyer, let's say you, might be $410. And that creates an anchor in the seller's mind, sometimes unconsciously, that now the official playground of this negotiation is between $410 and $500. This is not the bargaining zone. The bargaining zone we're going to define more clearly in a moment. This is just where we start. And so we have these two anchors, $500 and $410. Then in the minds of the negotiators, they say, okay, so upper limit is $500, lower limit is $410. Likely we're going to end up somewhere in the middle. In rare circumstances, people will say $410, and the seller might say, great, it's yours for $410. The problem with this is the buyer may initially think, wow, this is a great deal, but they may also experience a little bit of buyer's remorse, which is something we'll get into much more deeply later. And that is, well, if the person said yes to $410, maybe I should have offered $350. So that's something that we have to be aware of. We want to make sure that we present our offer in a way that does create a good anchor for the negotiation, doesn't annoy the seller in the sense that we come in, let's say, and offer $250 and they just don't think we're serious, we're just lowballing it, and they tell us to go away. And at the same time, we want to make sure we create an anchor in the mind of the seller that will force them to shift maybe a little bit even further in their own minds. If we come in and say $480, that creates a little range of $20. It doesn't mean precisely the bargaining zone, which again we're going to talk about in a second, but it does create a very narrow anchor point that means you're likely going to come in around $490 or so. But you have to think of in advance, what is it I really want to get out of this negotiation? What price do I really think I'm aiming for? And create a frame that target point falls into comfortably. So if you're trying to get whatever they're selling for $455, offering $410 gives you a much stronger likelihood that the seller will look at it and look at the anchor of your opening offer and say, okay, maybe this is a possibility. It's a bit of a mind trick, but it is quite important that you think about this very carefully because it can be quite powerful. More important than simply the asking price and initial offer, we need to look at where the bargaining zone is. And this is something we won't know right away. The bargaining zone, if we look at the diagram here, is simply defined. In this case, we see Alex's resistance point at around the $310,000 range and John's resistance point at $275,000. The space between these two resistance points is known as the bargaining zone. And this is because it's understood that outside of these resistance points, one of the parties is going to say no. So going into it, you won't necessarily know what the other person's resistance point is, and there are ways we can kind of try to figure it out. Sometimes the people will tell you, and it's great if they do tell you. I mean, it's often referred to as a bottom line, or we can't go past this. However, I find sometimes people will say they can't go past a certain point, and they actually can, so you have to be careful with that. So most of the time, you're going to have to figure it out as you go along. You have to do some educated guessing in advance, but as you go through the negotiation, you will be able to pick up on clues, behaviors that the person has, or things they say, to slowly kind of figure it out as you go along. And the last thing we're going to have a look at in this video tutorial is what a BATNA is. B-A-T-N-A. Very important principle in negotiation. It's your best alternative to a negotiated agreement. Essentially, this is what you have available to you if the negotiation is not successful. What will you do if you're not able to get what you need from the negotiation? Sometimes our alternatives are strong and sometimes they're not. What matters, though, for a good BATNA is that it be tangibly present. In other words, let's say you're looking for a job and you go and you start negotiating salary with a place you really want to work in. And you think to yourself, well, this doesn't work out. I can always get another job somewhere else, or I can interview somewhere else, or maybe you are interviewing. That is not a strong BATNA because you're relying on the potential or possibilities that might exist while you're negotiating. A strong BATNA in this situation is actually having another job offer that you are able to respond to if this one does not go well. A real job offer is a strong BATNA because you say to yourself, I have something in my pocket if this doesn't go forward. Clearly you're negotiating because this may be your preferred place of employment, but you do have that backup that's tangible. It's the same with virtually anything that you're negotiating. If you know for sure there are other things available, great. It doesn't mean you have to have a deal virtually in place or almost in place in order to negotiate, but you need to know that there are alternatives. So when your BATNA is strong, you can set your goals higher, you can make fewer concessions. And if you don't have a lot of alternatives, you're probably going to give in a little bit sooner. You might be a little reluctant. Overall, you do have less bargaining power. And this, by the way, doesn't mean you have to communicate that you have a BATNA to your opponent. To start with, it gives you that confidence that your opponent will pick up on. For all of us as negotiators, there may be a time where you bring up the fact that you have an alternative, but your opponent was probably thinking, so if you have an alternative, why are you there negotiating with them? Clearly, it's because that is the better option. However, the stronger your BATNA, the more power you're going to have both inside of you and your own self-confidence and in the negotiation dynamic you have with your opponent.